as soil cover if you cut them a bit higher up. Downside of that, it leaves them a bit messier. It's harder to walk through them if you don't plant them in rows. But what?
Gina says, what do you recommend for supporting Mediterranean fruit trees like peaches and almonds? More like a temperate system or subtropical or a mixture? Nice. That's a question.
Cool. Peaches and almonds. Yeah, so there's one issue with some of our pip and stone fruits is that they do need a bit more ventilation around them to prevent them from having certain rots. Yeah, like apple black spot and peach rot and this and that. So as people say in horticulture, ventilation is the best fungicide. So what does it leave us with then? Well, there's still a canopy to explore below your fruit trees, yeah. And if you do want to do a Mediterranean setting, then think of artichokes, think of lavender, borage, and these sort of things. If you're on a free draining soil, alfalfa is a great companion that can handle a wee bit of shade. If you're on clay, obvious, and comfrey and this and that. Yeah, there are some amazing examples of that if you follow the Facebook on the Syntropic community, what they have done over the years after Ernst visits in Loma Viva in southern Spain. Out of a desert, they have created this most amazing syntropic food forest. And the amount of plants that go between and underneath their fruit trees like olives and almonds and so on, which cannot handle that much density around them, but below them they have created amazing stuff. But having said that, there's still room above for certain things that you can prune whenever you feel that it's getting too shady. And don't forget, in the first few years, until trees start producing fruit, they actually don't need that much sun. The ventilation becomes necessary once they start fruiting. Up to that point, you don't want them all naked around, because that means just inviting grasses that you might not want, like creeping grass, couch grass, or kikuyu. And also, trees do like a bit of shade when they're young. It's just how they are evolved, that they come through a thicket of either blackberries or dog roses or whatever. And then when they fruit and they come actually through it, then they need the sun for the extra energy for their fruiting. But up to that time, you can put anything around them, whatever comes easy and cheap. So what comes easy and cheap is elderberry steaks, mulberry steaks, poplar steaks, titonia, Jerusalem artichokes, yakong, yeah, these sort of things. And observe what is already in your environment. If your environment is littered with dog roses, then don't go and say, oh, these horrible invasive dog roses, I don't want them here. You just say, well, they seem to work well. Dog roses and apple trees or peach trees, they might have evolved together. Let's see how they do together. Yeah. On the South Island in Otago, I've seen some beautiful examples of apple trees growing healthily, abundantly, beautifully shaped without any pruning, coming through a thicket of dog roses as if it was just made for them. So any of that is helpful, and you really still want the density, but you might want to opt for something that is easier to manage. So when you see in your area there's a lot of blackberries, and then you go, wow, I could put blackberries for my apples, but then you go for the thornless blackberries, makes your life easier and you get bigger fruit. So use common sense when it comes to ease of management. And then, of course, stick to rows. Even with those short-lived fillers, stick to rows. And if your tree row is not providing enough space to put all of those things in, then make another row a couple of feet or so next to your tree row, where you put your dog roses or your yakongs or your whatever, if you feel your tree row is already too cramped. But usually you're a bit too cautious with that. But nothing stops you from doing more rows next to your fruit trees. And then maybe you put things into these extra rows that you know eventually you will phase them out completely. And then it makes the access later on for harvesting a lot easier. So you know those rows on each side of your peaches or apples or whatever that you want to pick later with a ladder or whatever, these rows stay in for 3 years, give you all the root penetration and mulch and stimulus and nurse crop and whatever you can wish for. And after 3 years, you might even come through with a tractor and mow them all down and keep them so they don't come back up again. So you have the ease of harvesting them. And from there on, maybe you just leave it with comfrey and stuff that you can walk over at times of harvest, and it's not going to bother you. So then these helper trees get reduced to a walkable layer of forbs and so on that don't interfere. That's what I would recommend. And the question was more like a temperate system or subtropical or a mixture. Yeah, mixtures can work. You don't have to say just because the peaches are temperate and therefore you can't put in a yacon because it's a tropical. No, don't worry about that. Whatever does well in your climate, you can put them together. And keep in mind, you do want to mix up your evergreens and your deciduous when it comes to Mediterranean as well. You know, often we think of Mediterranean for some reason, it's all deciduous. No. Think of citrus and mixing it up with fig trees. That works well together.
That's quite a common thing that Ernst does, isn't it?
Yeah. And then another thing that you hear commonly worried about is that walnuts are a bad companion. Well, they're a bad companion to certain trees, not others. Some trees are not bothered at all by it. And apples, for instance, are meant to be really bad with it. So we haven't pushed that one, but we had some volunteer peach trees next to our beautiful Wilson Wonder walnut tree. We didn't plant it then, we wouldn't have done it. However, even so, the peach tree sort of underneath the canopy of the walnut tree, and there are a lot of other trees on that side, but it's sort of leaning away from it to get to the light. However, it's there now for 6 or so years, fruiting beautifully, and it's one of our healthiest peach trees of the lot. So, and then I stumbled across some notes by Ernst where he actually recommends the combination of walnut and peach tree. So here you go with common cliches that they're maybe not so practical proven sometimes. So yeah. But of course, you wouldn't want to invest in a whole orchard doing it the way that people tell you shouldn't do before you have done your own trials.
Then we've got a question from Alan. Hi, Alan. From Otaki, and you've also on a Patreon on a mentorship program, so awesome to see you on that as well. And your question is, do you use chickens in the system anywhere? Or do they stay in that compost greenhouse? So if all of you have watched our recent Patreon film where we showed our compost making process where we integrate the goats and the chickens in that space, basically we utilize the branches that we give to the goats, chip them up, make the compost bedding, and then that compost then every 6 weeks gets put into a pile. And then before it matures, before we dig into it, once it's matured, we first put our mobile chicken sort of greenhouse structure on top of that, and the chickens scratch away on it, breaking up the compost for us and eating the extra compost worms there that would otherwise leave that space, giving them that rich protein diet that they need. So that's basically our compost system in a nutshell. There was a video to that last week, so that's what Alan's referring to in terms of the compost greenhouse. And in terms of greenhouse chickens and other systems, we have used them in the food forest before. However, you have to be pretty fast moving them along those spaces because we're on quite a steep slope, so they naturally scratch everything downhill. So unless you really have good terrace structures and you're only doing it temporary, then it's great sort of nitrogen boost, but they do a lot of havoc and they do have a tendency to scratch everything down. So in a food forest system on a slope, not so much. We have had them in our orchards as well. That's worked really well over the years when we had more of a traditional orchard where we just had the trees and grass underneath, or a sort of herb grass underneath, and the chickens would move through that periodically, giving those trees lots of nitrogen, not staying too long, that would scratch up the feeder roots of the trees. But as we transition more into a syntropic temperate orchard down there, we sort of phased the chickens out of there as well because they were just scratching around too much of the new things that we were planting. So the best way that we would see chickens is really giving them their natural habitat. So giving them somewhere where they can constantly scratch for nutrient-dense protein food. So that's why the compost is a great match for them. And also, they would be a great start to a food forest block. So what we've sort of always envisioned is having like potentially that chicken mobile greenhouse that we have, and doing that as an initial sort of block, letting them really fertilize that area, scratch away all the grass and the weeds, then moving that block on to the next, moving it along one, and then where they were previously, then coming straight away with your density of plants and grasses and seeds, and starting the food forest system that way, as a way of clearing out the vegetation that's there via the chickens, and offering that really nitrogen-rich manure as well. Again, which you can put the vegetables right in as well, and they'll have a great crop in that first year, soaking up all those nutrients. So that's where we always see chickens would be a really good space. And Jeff Lawton also has quite a lot of good videos on that as well. So yeah, that marriage between those two elements, chickens establishing food forest or establishing gardens, but chickens in an established garden or food forest is always just a little bit tricky. And yeah, we've had them in our market garden a bit before as well, and sort of hoop tunnel areas, but they do have a tendency to escape, and then all your seedlings get ripped out. So yeah, they're really beneficial in that space, but also can cause a lot of harm, so you just got to be aware of that. But in summary, setting up food forests.
I mean, the fertilizer aspect is it's true, but it's a bit overrated, because it doesn't take you long to scratch up the manure from a chicken thing and put it into your food forest. That's not a biggie. What we noticed, so as Frida was talking about, we had it sometimes in startup phases and sometimes even in reset phases. The beauty of that is, because you take your compost bucket there then, and they scratch around, you often find that there's a far bigger density of all sort of trees coming up in that than you would have put in if you just started normal. And that can be quite helpful, because you realize, oops, look at that stuff, I would have forgotten about that, and here it is. So there's that advantage. And the other thing is, you usually always have a bit of a slope, no matter what land you have. You could say, okay, you put a lot of wood chips, if you have access to that, or stable manure, or large amounts of compost, whatever, you put them on one side, on the higher side of your chicken run, and then have the chickens spreading it for you whilst they pick out the bugs and so on. So let them do a job for you. Okay, that way they don't take topsoil away from the place, but they spread the mulch that you dump there for you. So we have done that, and it worked quite nicely. Like, ute loads full of horse manure, and this are full of worms, and they spread it for you, rip it apart, and mix it for you. So that's nice. But as soon as you leave them in too long, the place starts becoming naked, and that then becomes low water infiltration and just a mess. So unless you move them a lot, it's awful, and moving a lot is a lot of work. Ducks could be a better choice, but not if you have bananas. They eat your pups.
And then we've got Campbell and Nikki from Kawakawa on board. So we'll wait for your questions to come through. And then we've got Bevan from Hikurangi. And I just saw your comment that you had difficulty getting on, and you went on the YouTube channel to hop on. I think just for future, for us, there's been issues with doing our scheduling live Q&A. So I think next month we'll try just put out the link 10 minutes before the hour, and then we'll hop on a live stream rather than a scheduled stream. Hopefully that will take away some technical errors on both sides. And then we've got Heather as well from Whangaripo.
Where's Whangaripo?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Have to look that up. And then we've got Georgia adding on, what are your thoughts on Italian alders versus poplars, or do they get too large? I'm just going to quickly jump in before class does, because I can answer this one. But you can add on afterwards. Main difference for me is the root structure of them both. So poplars are cutting grown or by stakes, and Italian alders you can do from seed. So whatever
you normally do only from seed, yeah.
Only from seed. So the difference between that is anything that's seed propagated has a much better root structure because they have a taproot, versus cut and grown things which don't have taproots. So even though throats go. So yeah, so that would be the main difference, is the root structure that you get. So in that regard, the Italian alder would be I would place above the poplar in that sense because it has a better root structure. However, the Italian poplars do grow a lot slower, even though they are regarded as a really fast-growing tree, and especially out of the older species, they are still quite drastically slower than a poplar would be. So I think matching the two together would be still a good idea. So you get the best of both worlds. You get that fast pioneer of the poplar, giving you that biomass, that sort of early biomass, early trunks that you can place down as retaining walls if you're on a slope or regardless. But then you've got maybe every other one as an Italian alder that will then grow slower but have that better root structure between the poplars. That would be my take on it. And I'm sure class is going to touch on all the different deciduous properties of them both as well.
Thanks, Frida. Now, I mean, one of the differences, of course, that you might want to consider is the nitrogen issue, that alders do fix nitrogen, not like a legume tree. They are, with the Frankia fungus that they associate with, they're not quite as effective with that. But nevertheless, they are nitrogen fixers, of course. They make better shiitake logs for us. That's another upside for us. Poplar deteriorates too fast. But the common comments that we hear and we see ourselves is that Italian alder just grow ridiculously slow compared to what they say in the catalog. And now one thing could be is that they might need a bit of soil from other established alders to get going with their fungi and in general mycorrhiza possibly missing. Could also be that just for the first year they're slow, second, third year suddenly they pick up a bit. But there's definitely a huge difference. And of course, with a poplar log, you're already 2 meters up there before you even have the first leaf showing up. That is nice. And but yeah, as Frida says, ideally you have them both. And once the Italian alders take over, you get rid of the poplars.
And also depends what situation you're putting them in, because if you are in dense kikuyu or some other kind of vegetation, having that head start by being able to put in a whole cutting that goes above that existing vegetation is always a good start. So basically, as a summary, they both have their values. Putting them together would be great. But yeah. And you can also do mushrooms on alder, different ones. So poplars would be oyster, and the tawaka, the native mushroom, more of those soft wood-loving mushrooms. And then with the alders, you could do shiitake and okitake and those much harder line-made, those hardwood-loving mushrooms. So you can inoculate them both with mushrooms, though. So that's another plus for them both. Liz? Hi, Liz. Her question is, do you have any recommendations for an emergent layer in an area that does not get some frost? Would loquats work as an emergent? Thank you. For emergent layer in an area that does get some frost. Raisin trees would be a great one.
I was going to say that.
And Liz, I think you from our PDC course, I hope. If so, we know you really well. Sorry to be cold, I just can't see your last name, so it might be a whole different list. Anyway, yeah, so raising trees would be, so I meant does get some frost. Yeah, sweet. So yeah, raisin trees do handle a lot of frost. So they would be a great fast growing pioneer. You can grow them from seeds, so they have that nice taproot. They're self-pruning, so yeah, really low maintenance, and they're a good timber. They also produce a fruit, so that's a plus. So highly recommend the raisin trees. Then you could do poplars as well as a frost emergent. You could do honey locust frost.
Yeah, definitely honey locust is it is a bit a slower one, but it's definitely an emergent one. You can't keep it under anything really, but it is a slow one. You have to sort of make sure that it gets enough room to actually do it, or have other slow things around it. Yeah. And then one that works also really well is Paulownia. Yeah, Paulownia is an emergent. It's a bit frightening with its big leaves. It looks like it's too dominant, and trees with huge leaves like that, the same in the tropics with teak, or what we see with our Cecropia, very big leaf trees, they can actually smother some of your grasses and whatnot below. It's part of their function. But I mean, you can rake them away and whatnot, not a problem. But Paulownia is nicely pruned as well. You can shape it up as you wish. And I've seen nice examples of Paulownia being planted throughout market gardens, heavily pruned like beanstalks, and just a little thing up there. You can't kill them, of course. You can copy them and whatnot. You can't kill them. They have an early leaf drop in winter, which is nice, and a phenomenal strong growth. Now, people would tell you, yeah, but there's superficial root systems and this and that. They're going to be greedy. Yes, but they're not going to take it away and hide it somewhere. They're going to bring it back into the system as soon as you prune it. So don't worry about these things. And it is sort of very similar to the fowl. Yeah, we use the fowl tree a lot as a soft, fast-growing native evergreen as an understory. And Paulownia, different family, but it's sort of the same function of fowl, but higher up. And it also makes fodder and all sort of things. So there's that. Now the question is, loquat, does that make a good emergent? A loquat is great. You know, we all know it's a weedy plant. It's even on the list somewhere. It is great, fast-growing, robust tree. Only thing, it gets a lot of puriri moth. But apart from it's great, it's a fantastic goat fodder all year round, if you're into that. And yeah, it's fast-growing. It gives you the fruit on top of everything else. I wouldn't call it an emergent layer, so I would consider it as a high layer. But yeah, it's a beautiful tree to have around, and can't go wrong with it. And if you think you have too many or you don't like it, take it out. Didn't cost you anything. Just put the seeds in. Don't buy a plant. Grow it from seeds. You're fast enough. And then eucalypts. Don't forget the eucalypts. Yeah. So see, if you're in a frost area and maybe you're again focusing a lot on deciduous trees because it's all apple trees and this and that. You do want, in New Zealand, in our climate here, which is not that cold, you do want some evergreen plants that can grow through winter. That's the time when you have the water. That's the time when you still have enough sun for these guys to grow. So why not having some evergreens to make use of that? And as a emergent, and then you try to have some evergreens lower down, of course. Now there you can fill in a lot of native shrubs, mahoy and whatnot, that handle frost to some degree, and silverberry, for instance, as a fruit. Yeah. So don't forget your evergreens, even when you're in a frosty, temperate climate.
And the other thing between frost zones and more subtropical zones is that your ratios in the stratas differ. So when you're in a temperate zone, you're looking at a much lighter emergent canopy. So that's where having those deciduous emergent trees is quite nice, to let that light go down to the floor and not create too much ventilation issues for your more sensitive trees like your apples and peaches and stuff that you tend to have in a temperate zone. So typically you have more like a 5% canopy layer of the emergent trees, and then your main strata in a temperate zone is actually your low layer. So that's where you have the herb forbs and the ground covers, the berries, that tends to occupy traditionally and in native situations more the lower layer. So it's 90% of the strata in the lower layer is taken up, versus like a tropical or subtropical, you tend to see not much actually on the ground low layers and a lot above in the more emergent and high canopies. So yeah, I think walking through a tropical rainforest versus through a berry tree forb in Europe. So yeah, those are sort of what you're playing with. So when you do design your food forest for your different climates, you plant to the density for that. So you allow for higher density of plants in the lower levels if you're in the temperate zone. So the species you select for your emergence would be more your deciduous trees and placed further apart to allow that sun to go down to the bottom.
Good. Thank you.
And then we've got the loop crew. So Campbell and Nikki, any tips on slug snail control on initial annuals like brassicas? Are they an issue for you? We're doing cheap beer in bowls and nighttime torch harvesting. Yeah, no.
No, I think you should buy really sort of expensive organic beer whilst you're at it. I think they would prefer that. All right. In our garden, we have patek coming in at nighttime, and they probably do some of that. We do go down with torches and then boil them up for the chickens that don't like them without boiling. But that's awful hard work, and we are over that really. So the best advice for that is make sure that your brassicas are really strong when you put them in and not too late. So, and we make this mistake year after year, again and again. So you actually have to start sowing your brassica sort of February, March, and be generous with your pots. So transplant them into, say, strawberry pots and get them really going strong, and then put them out for your winter garden and make sure that they have enough time to get established. So they don't have to actually try to get into shape during winter. They're already in shape, and from there on, it's just replacing the leaves that you're picking off. That's what you try to achieve. And, you know, as a good teacher, is always teaching something that we don't do ourselves, but we hope we get there someday. So yeah, that's the important thing, to get big plants out before the growth slows down so much that the plants get overrun by slugs, and it's too late for them to recover. So that's my biggest advice on that. And yeah.
But you know, with if you sort of see them as a resource in that sense, if you've got chickens as well, that makes it great. You just have to boil them up, otherwise they don't eat them. So there is a plus side for that, for the chickens anyway. or ducks or pigs or something that you have.
All right.
Yeah, one for me, one for the slugs.
Do you stratify alder seeds from Alan Hardwood? We have done it once years ago, and it worked. So stratification in this context doesn't mean the strata in the food forest. It means you put the seeds in moist sand or sawdust and put them in the fridge for a few months, so they get the experience of a Nordic winter, and then they start sprouting uniformly as soon as they hit the ground and it's a bit warmer. Yeah, we have done that, but then overall, we have fallen a bit out of love with alders because of their slowness, and found other plants that work better for us for nitrogen fixation and speed and management. But we do like the black alders along streams in boggy areas because they can handle heavy waterlogging. That's not a problem for them. So, and they're the most useful tree for us when it comes to that, apart from liquid amber, which we would rather have a bit more of. But yeah, black alder is our main tree that we use for shiitake production, and so on. But the thing is, if you go to tree nurseries, you can get them in root trainers for so cheap. I personally wouldn't want to bother with seeding them myself anymore. I'd rather spend my time where it matters a bit more. But yeah, it's definitely doable. Keep in mind that if you have different species of alders, they can hybridize quite happily with each other. So if you have Italian alder and Peruvian alder, something, you might actually find you have hybrids there rather than the thing that you think you get. Tagasaste. Any reason we haven't seen it in your videos? Yes, they are quite shy usually. On our slopes where we have 100% clay, we did put them in initially, and they would grow to 1 meter or 2, and they would look very sad, and they were growing so slow. They would get overrun by everything else, and they would get riddled by tea tree borer. So obviously they didn't enjoy our clay. Down in the market garden area where it's free draining, previous owners of or occupants of that area had a windbreak of Tagasaste there that got removed before we started. We had the occasional seedling coming up from that still years after, and they did really fine down there with the frost, with the free draining soil. So we often don't think about them enough. We could have put them into our Syntropy rows down there. However, again, the speed of them is not impressive. And sure, they're nice fodder and everything, but so is brush wattle. They're great fodder, and they grow 3 times faster. So why bother for us with Tagasaste? Yes, they're not on a weed list, and yes,
and you can prune them back more than you
they're
can
nice
brush
for
wattles.
wood pitching and so on, and you can prune them. Yeah, thanks, Frida. They are highly prunable. You can polar them and whatever you want to do to them, they don't mind it. Whereas brush wattle, we know it's not that easy, and so therefore, for staying longer in a lower system between your fruit trees could be nicer than brush wattle in the long run, absolutely. And yeah, we should have put more in.
So basically, the crux is, you're right, we should see them more, but in our temperate, well, not necessarily temperate, but our temperate areas where we have the better soils, and they need that. They don't really take good clay soil.
But keep in mind, Tagasaste origin is the dry volcanic islands of the Canaries. So think of dry volcanic slopes, cold in winter, hot in summer, dry in summer, moist in winter. So if your land ticks those boxes, then put them in. But yeah, they're drought resistant, extreme resistance. There are other plants that can outperform them in better conditions. And as you know, with Syntropy, we always want to go for the racing horses for that particular environment. And for us, they're not exactly that. So we have better choices here. But yeah, if further south, say Wellington area, say for you, for instance, Alan, sandy soils, windy West Coast, Kapiti, great. You have them growing like weeds there. That's already a good indicator. So by all means, use them maybe instead of brush wattle, or see which one performs better, or have them both, whatever. Yeah.
And then Then we've got Georgina asking, could you expand that's right.
Oh, I think we have another one here soon.
Oh, sorry, you've jumped a few. Sorry, we'll get to you, Georgina. Then we've got
the book.
The book. Yeah. So Campbell put a little plug in there for the Ultimate Fruit and Nut Guide books by Susanna Lyle that I had recommended in the Patreon comment a while back. Those arrived just last week, and yeah, it's a very good book. Yeah. It's for those people wanting to, because there's not really many resources where you get to see the life cycle and the strata and the succession. That's really not out there. We're sort of working in the catalogue. But that book is really nice to just go through. It gives a nice sort of detailed profile on each plant. And she's a New Zealand writer as well, so she's a bit biased, even though it's sort of like worldwide, she's biased to New Zealand, so it's quite nice. But it's a really nice reference book to get ideas, expand vocabulary of what trees are out there, and the information that she gives on that, you can decipher where they are in the strata and life cycle through that, even though it's not specifically written. So it is a really good resource for that. So yeah, thanks for
it's also a visually nicely done book. And I like it when authors put their species in a sequence of plant families. I think that makes so much sense, and she does that, and I think that's the way to do it. And the only thing I found when reading through the book, I get totally excited about some fruit in there, and then at the end of the description goes like needs free draining soil, and we go but having said that, our soils are getting free draining just by the management we give them, and yeah, avocados start looking really nice here. So yeah, suddenly it opens
and
up.
maybe even Takasaki soon.
It should give another go. Yeah, I want to do that one.
Which one?
Oh,
the flame tree.
Okay, the loop crew. What's the best way to guarantee success for flame tree cuttings and stakes? So, all right, make sure you put them in the right way, not upside down. That doesn't work well. Even so, some of them might manage.
It's actually hard to decipher. Like, you do need to look,
yeah,
because the branches sometimes grow sort of thick and thin, so it's not so easy as just to put the feather in.
Maybe you leave the thorns on; they can show you the direction a bit. We had a woofer once putting some the other way around, and yeah, that didn't work. But if you put them in the right way at this time of the year, or even any time of the year, and you can't get them going, then maybe you should look for a career change.
As in that they really take a lot to, very easy to propagate, and that is the downside, is that they become a weedy aspect. So maybe guarantee success might be, maybe your question's framed as like success of it not going rampant, potentially.
Yeah.
I might want to clarify.
Yeah, maybe that's the question. How do you stop them from being too successful?
Because they can literally grow from just a small chip or bigger, size chip. So they are super easy to take root. So I'm guessing your thing is more guaranteeing success of them not going crazy. And that would be heavy pruning management. We've got trees that you would have seen in our last, second to last video where Klaus was in the terraces. So all those tree trunks were flame trees, and they're all up to 12 years old now. 12 years old, and they're still only about this big, when if you pictured a 12-year-old frame tree that wasn't managed, it would be massive, and you'd have to have an arborist in to take it down. So that heavy constant pruning twice a year, only leaving one whip, so one sort of stem up each time you prune, makes the trunk stay small, makes the whole tree really manageable, means you can use that as a constant biomass production, but it not get unruly and out of control. So yeah, that would be the success of how to manage a flame tree, is just really diligently prune and have your succession plan afterwards. So make sure that you're planting not just flame trees on their own, but you've got a whole load of other trees underneath, and your next emergent trees that are going to overtake the flame trees eventually, like ingot trees or raisin trees, and all your consortium plants around that, so that when you do actually want to get rid of them and you cut them at the base, it'll only take a few times, they'll re-sprout, and then you keep cutting it at the base, and then the density of shade that you have by your other trees that you've planted at the same time as them, they will no longer have enough energy because they need the full sun to actually keep growing. So that is how you phase them out. And we have actually had some prematurely get out of a system because we have outshaded them more than we would have liked to, and they have died on us. So it is certainly possible to get out of that situation, but there's such a great start to your food forest system to get it going, especially on a steep slope, because they have a really fibrous, dense root network that really holds the hill together, as well as just being really fast growing. You can again plant them from stake, instant terrace poles, and then you can keep blocking the branches on the sides. So yeah, they're a great pioneer tree, but you really do need to know what you're doing and prune them heavy.
Yeah. And a thing that I thought about when we did the terrace last time, I don't know, did I mention it in the video, putting koi in between the flame trees?
No, I didn't.
See, when you use the flame trees like we do, sort of like 1.20 meters apart or whatever we do, they're already established. And in our steep slope, there's not, on the lower part, there's not that much else growing there apart from the vertebra grass. So I thought, well, how about putting a koi tree in each center of those? They come up in the shade, and it's actually not that shady in winter when we prune them. And in winter is when the koi would grow like native trees do. And so they would slowly make their way up between the flame trees. And there's no hurry, who cares? I'm not waiting for fruit from them. And then at some point, they will pass the pollarding cutoff of the flame trees. And then we can decide, okay, now we maybe cut the flame trees really low now. We still get maybe 1 or 2 years of mulch out of them before they finally give up. And that feeds the koi then. And then we end up with having a koi forest, which can easily handle a steep slope like that, and possibly gives us future timber. And if not, we have a future forest there. So it's all win-win. And so I think that would be a nice way of fading out of flame trees eventually in these areas where we use flame trees actually just as a erosion control for our steep slope.
I see here the next comment by you, Campbell, was, we were late getting them in. So I'm thinking maybe that's in reference to them not being successful actually taking off. And that I haven't, are they that sensitive to?
They shouldn't, but I mean, if it's really dry, and then what can happen, you see, like with oil cuttings, as I mentioned earlier, if when you put them in late spring, and the sun warms up the stems, they start making new shoots very fast, but the roots haven't caught up with them yet. I mean, it can happen. So yeah.
Anything that you plant by stake initially in soil, is best to do in a time when you've got regular rain or some sort of irrigation, I suppose.
Or even consider putting something in that holds the humidity in the planting hole. Yeah. So rather than just sticking them in the ground. And then the other thing is also the ratio between what's in the ground, what's above ground. So when you shove it in the ground is a bit hard. You don't make a hole for them, you just shove them in. Then they can get wiggled around a bit. That can disturb their roots that they're forming. And then also they might make too many leaves up there already because they have too many buds opening, and there's not enough room for roots down here, and they're not deep enough to be moist for those roots to form, because the roots form right at the end usually. Initially, they can later on also form a bit higher up. But if it's all too high up and doesn't reach down into the subsoil, then there might be a moisture issue, of course. So you might want to actually drill into the ground or really open it up nice to get deeper in there. So A, the stake doesn't wiggle around, and B, you get to a more permanently moist layer that gets you going.
So next question then is, Georgina, Could you expand reed density with subtropical rows? E.g., how far apart do you put pioneer emergence than longer-term emergence and medium strata in a row? Likewise, longer-term high and low density, e.g. avos. Well, typically so when you go about designing the food forest, start from the trees that you are buying, and B, your longer living trees that take the most space, and then work to space them out appropriately. And usually the ballpark meterage for sort of larger fully grown trees is 4 to 5 meters. So for example, you're saying avocados there, I'd space them out 4 to 5 meters apart, and then in between that you might have your next sort of quite big tree like a persimmon or a citrus, and then I'd plant them in the middle, so again 4 meters apart, and then go in with your more sort of versatile mulching crops that can sort of fit in the middle spaces, and then plant those sort of on either side. So you start getting the idea that you work from the top down, basically your longer living trees that you're buying, and how big they grow, space them out. But if, as much as possible, still do things by seed and still go denser than you would. So like, for example, our raisin trees, we plant sometimes every meter, even though in real life, if they all actually matured to their full size, they would be competing for that strata and suffer, not creating the right environment for the lower canopy. But with thinking that some won't always make it, so going as dense as you can allows for any ones to be accidentally cut, or cicadas ringbark them, or a rabbit comes in and chops it out. All those factors that you have to account for, which is what you account for with density. So anything that you can do by seed, cuttings, or source yourself, just go really hard, just the whole row, and that way you can select the ones that are doing the best. So I wouldn't be so picky on the density of that. I would just go almost a loquat every 50 centimeters, an avocado every meter, just have it all come up, and then select out the appropriate density as time goes on. And then things that you grow from seed, like you might do certain macadamias from seed, and you might wait actually until they produce a crop, or let's say cherimoya, until they produce a crop before you decide whether you want to keep them or not, because maybe the fruit isn't as nice as another one. So all that variation is what that density allows you to pick and choose. And it's no waste of space. It's all biomass in the end. So even you grow 10 avocados in 4 meters and you only ever keep one, those other 9 you can let grow to the first fruit if you want as well. And then in the end, they'll just become biomass. So they've done the same job as any other supporting biomass tree along with you, and it's come from seed. So don't be too meticulous in the design process. But if you were to design it or choose to do it like that, or if you can't source as many seeds, then 4 to 5 meters for your main trees, and then sort of work into that as you go down in the lower stratas. Yeah. But trying to keep, the main thing to keep important is that even in the establishment, you might put as much density as you want, and just then in mind that the maintenance of that over time, you've got to be a little bit more onto it, because you have got to, like if you put in 10 avocados in that 4 meters, then obviously that is going to take up a lot of the emergent canopy or high canopy layer. And so your other more sun-loving trees might get a little bit sun-starved. So you just got to be onto the maintenance of that. So pruning back the ones that aren't working quite fast to allow for anything on the lower stratas to come through. So density is key, but it just means that you then have to be on your management. And that's not hard to do. Super easy and super fun with a machete and a sickle. But it just takes that observation to just start recognizing signs where your trees might be a bit stagnated or not growing very much. Like for example, up on my land, I've got Inga beans growing underneath as my eventual climax emergent tree. and I had a whole sort of food forest strata of different trees, the brush wattles, faux, tamarillos, teutonia. And what I found is they've been really slow growing because I've sort of kept that shade quite dense, just expecting that they'd make their way up. But that you really need to, that's where the pulsing comes in Syntropy. So seasonal pulsing allows for sun wells to be opened up for a tree to do that next bounce up in season before it all closes up again. So that's what that pulsing is sort of pulling those lower, the trees that need to be at the top that are sort of working their way up, pulls them up each time you pulse the system. So yeah, that's something that you would have to keep in mind if you do go dense, which we do recommend, is to factor in more regular pulsing times to really allow for those trees to get pulled up through the strata and not get lost down the bottom and be stagnant.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a fine balance between optimum density and starving your crops of sunlight. So you have to be able to read that and understand the strata of your crops well. When we talk about shade, we normally talk about dynamic shade, which is different from a stagnant shade. And they can get through some spells of shade as long as they get once in a while these windows that Frida was talking about. However, plants need sunlight to produce substances to defend themselves against fungal attack and insects and so on. And you can see often when the plant starts getting something or another that it might be a sunlight issue. But having said that, it can also be the other way around. You can have, for instance, a sick citrus tree in the full sunlight, but you have a citrus that is in a semi-shade in your food forest and it's totally healthy and productive. So you can have both. But these are the signs that you need to read. And trees that are full of whiteflies or tamarillos full of whiteflies, they're either having too much sun or they don't have enough sun. But they should be sorted out with the right condition. Now another word here now, and that's probably very interesting for you, Alan, as well. When we talk avocados here, any tree that you buy as a grafted tree, you don't overplant because you don't want to get rid of them later on because they're too dense. So you grafted trees, you plant out in the distance you want them eventually, but you make sure that you fill up everything in between them with the cheaper inputs that Frida talked about. So then at the end, you might still end up with your grid of your grafted trees without having to thin them out. And then there's another thing to consider. Some conventional organic avocado growers say they make an orchard with just avocados and say the ideal population of an acre of avocados might be 40 trees or whatever. I don't have the number in my head now, but what these growers do then is they say, okay, how about that? We just cram 3 times the amount of avocados in. It costs me $40 a tree or something. And for the first 5 years, I get so many avocados, makes it worthwhile. And they just want to stick with avocados to fill the space. Now, the problematic thing about that is that avocados are prone to Phytophthora, even in good conditions. In Syntropy, we avoid Phytophthora more than any other system, I know that. However, it can happen. And Phytophthora seems to go really rampant when the root structures of one tree meets the root structure of another tree. When the root tips start meeting, they react to that badly with Phytophthora, and then it spreads like wildfire. So make sure that you have something else between your avocados. So don't go into that, oh, let's just put more avocado trees in here, and after a few years we send them out, they have paid for themselves more than 5 times. No, it's not a good idea. Put something else in between in that space rather than filling it up with more avocado trees that you can easily pick standing whilst they're young and then get rid of them. I mean, sure, it sounds like a good business idea, but according to the experience of some growers, it is a recipe for getting Phytophthora, having the root zones, the roots touching each other. So make the space in between avocado trees, other shrubs, ideally shrubs that don't get affected by Phytophthora, because otherwise they become hosts. Yeah. So if it's a business, watch it when you can for those sort of things. Yeah, put something else in between and make it eucalypt or whatever, that you don't feel heart pain when you want to get rid of them at some point. Yeah, any filler is good. And yeah, just don't fill it up with more avocado trees. It's expensive and you might invite trouble.
So our next question is by Alan. Market garden. Do you lay crop waste directly on the bed as you would for a tree bed, or do you keep the grass mulch and put crop waste somewhere else? Veg crop waste seems to get a bit slimy. Agreed. Well, because we've got goats and chickens, we do selectively harvest and utilize the tops of our veggie waste, and we feed it either to chickens or the goats. And then a lot of weeds that we might pull up in the market garden that we don't really want to lay there again, like any bindweed that comes up, or speedwell or kikuyu roots, we put those in as bedding of the goat stable as well, and the goats sort of pommel it to death. So that's how we deal with a lot of our crop waste and weed residues from the garden. In our syntropy rows, where we have planted veggies in the first year into that row, we have like, for example, if we do corn or kale, any waste from that we do mulch directly on site. But because we're moving up to the layers, we're not going in again to broad fork or plant seedlings again. It works really well. However, if you are continually maintaining as an annual bed, you're totally right. Some of those veggie waste can go quite slimy because they sort of form this sort of dense mat like layer, and also it just makes it really difficult later on to do any broad forking, or if you tilling on there. So that's why we do keep it to the chickens or the goats. But we do always make a point of keeping the roots of the veggies waste in the soil. So instead of pulling up the whole corn plant, we leave the roots down and then just cut the stalks away. We actually make silage with the corn stalks as well. So if you do have animals, that's another good way of utilizing old corn stalks. We just chip it up, mix it up with a bit of salt like you would sauerkraut, put it in a drum. So yeah, bit of a side note, but it's a good way of using corn stalks. But yeah, overall, we do have a different line for that. We use mainly our grass. Grass is the coxwood grass that we have on either side of the garden beds to mulch onto our beds because it's a lighter mulch and easier to plant into. Yeah, if we didn't have goats and chickens, would we put it directly on? Probably.
It's debatable. On one side, you could say maybe slugs prefer the rotting vegetable leftovers over the fresh vegetables, or do you breed them in there and attract them? It's hard to say. But I mean, if you have a choice of mulch, I would rather remove that stuff and put it on your compost and so on. And for your vegetables, if you want to keep growing vegetables in between your tree rows, then what we do is we try to find bamboo from our bamboo hedge, chip that. That is fantastic mulch. It is immediately filling up with mycelium like so, which you wouldn't get on your vegetable base. And the other one, believe it or not, even so we grow hundreds of flame trees ourselves. We don't chip any of those. We mulch them just like so into branches because then we walk on them and we don't compact. And when we do want flame tree chips, we go down the road where people want to get rid of them and chip them up and use them in our garden beds. It's probably one of the best mulches you can hope for.
So our next question is, so carrying on comment from Alan saying, so you don't throw in more avo seeds in the avo block. So don't throw in more avocado seeds in the avo. So I'm guessing he's got an avo. You know his story a bit more than.
Yeah. If you have big gaps, yes, but otherwise, I would be careful with that. Turning them into big trees, and then that is an advice that I got from a organic avocado grower, that he thought he would never get Phytophthora, and then he noticed as soon as the trees got big enough that the roots would touch each other, suddenly they all went belly up with Phytophthora. And he said he noticed it with other people as well. So that's an advice I would send on. And there are a lot of other choices you can put in there. You mentioned macadamias. Mix it up with macadamias. Mix it up with citrus. Whatever you feel you can sell, Alan, your commercial. Yeah, see what sells in your area. And lucuma, yeah, right. You should be mild enough, and your soil is free draining. Give lucuma a thought. I mean, lucuma is a superfood. Nobody sells it in New Zealand, and we won't make a dent into our local market with that when ours come on. Think lucuma. I don't think lucuma is so susceptible to Phytophthora. It might be, but so far it looks a lot hardier than avocados to me. And yeah, fill it up with that. That would be safer. And then maybe the rest of your property that you didn't consider for avocados, maybe you put some more avocados there if you want more avocados. And also, don't forget, I don't know what avocado trees you ordered. Don't forget to think about other varieties that are not Haas for local markets. Yeah, consider reed. Yeah, a friend of us is doing good business, and he only got reed, and he has actually a niche for just the reeds when nobody else has avocados. Now,
So another question by Alan Sorghum and Sudan. The specialty seeds one is treated with a fungicide. Did you do anything special to deal with that?
Right.
Because carrying on from that, we're certified organic, so would have to take some measures if we want to use it. Would be interested in splitting a bag if you can use it, and anyone else is interested.
Well, we had been before with Demeter, and when it was not a standalone certification anymore, we stopped doing that. But if you can prove that this is the only source of seeds you can get here for that, and you want it and need it, then what they tell you is you wash it off and seed it afterwards. So you can do that. But I talked to Curtis at Specialty Seeds recently and pestered him for untreated sorghum Sudan. I raved over it, and I sent him some more films, and he loved them. And I mean, he's on our side, no doubt about that. And he said he would try to find untreated seeds, and it might be too hard for him, and we might put it in the too hard basket. However, I mean, all of us, we should constantly harass people like that. Why can't you provide untreated seeds? And they have to adjust to that market, because there is such a demand now showing up for cover crops in the biological and then spilling over into the organic world, of course, that they would be stupid not to do that. But as long as we don't demand it and really pester them, it's not going to change. So yeah, just patience and keep asking. And I will ring him up again and see how far he got with it and let you guys know then. And then Alan's also offering splitting a bag. That sounds a great idea. Cool. Yeah. I mean, otherwise.
Yeah, so if anyone is interested in doing that, that would be kind of a nice way of collaborating. So yeah, if you are interested, maybe Alan, if you want to, on our
maybe we should take it on.
Okay, I'll put a comment. I'll put a post out to everyone on our Patreon page, and then people can just link in and check in if they're interested, and that way it's all in one comment section.
Yeah, let me get back to him, and if he has sourced it, then definitely gonna buy back. Otherwise, he might still buy back. But we give him a hard time. Right. Yeah. So yeah, let's see how we do that. We have a lot of other people that are not on Patreon that would be interested as well. So I'm sure if we buy a whole bag, we can get rid of it. Definitely. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, if anyone's got any last questions. So I talked with Stefan and said treated only.
Oh,
Well, hopefully we can pressure them into
yeah.
changing that. Yeah, if anyone's got any last questions, fire away now. Otherwise, we'll start. Closing it down. We'll wait for 1 more minute.
I mean, talking about treated seeds, it's just such a stupid thing to do. As we all know now, is that as soon as the root comes out of the seed, it has to actually get infected with its own endophytes and fungi that the seeds should already carry, just like, you know, a newborn gets the microbiome from the mother. The seed gets it from its own seed hull and everything, and in the mycorrhiza and so on has, you know, sorghum Sudan is a high mycorrhizal plant. You want them from first second to be colonized, so it's ridiculous. But anyway, we keep on working on that, and I'm sure we get somewhere someday.
Cool. So got another question from Campbell from the Loop crew. Machete brand we use, Tramontina, Brazilian steel brand. I can put that on maybe I'll put that on the comment section, a link at the end on this video for the different shops that sell them. But yeah, Tramontina is the brand name. The Tool Shed, Trade Me sometimes has them, and if you're in Auckland, there's a guy in the Avondale markets that sells the machetes there as well. But yeah, Tramontina.
Blade Master, Auckland, yeah.
Blade Master, yeah. So then another question about Alan. Resources, any English favorite info resource that you would use to follow? Scott Hall and Syntropic Ag Community, Facebook, Agroforestry Academy, YouTube. All those are really great. Scott Hall's awesome. I went and worked with him in Australia and did a women's course there on his farm. So I highly recommend following his videos. He's got some really nice insights. So what else after that? There's the Agenda Gotch. Not specifically English, but they have English subtitles.
Not very active at the moment.
No, but the past videos.
I just bought a book that came out from Brazil, but it's in Portuguese. I bought it as an ebook. It's we also just do an online course from Brazil. It's in Portuguese with English subtitle, but somehow they're not quite linked up that well. So it's okay. I understand Portuguese enough to figure out, but for people that are new to Syntropy and don't speak Portuguese or understand Portuguese, that's a bit a hard one. But yeah, Scott Hall, soak everything up that he releases. He doesn't do a lot, some short videos on Facebook and so on, but everything he comes up with is really worth watching. He's really onto it big time. Again, it's not quite the right climate for us, but it's about principles mostly. And of course, it's nice to hear also which plant work in what context. That's where we come in. There's
also, I'm not sure if it's on there, the Syntropy handout. I'm not sure it's in his comment there, or is that the Syntropy one?
Which one is that?
The animated one.
Oh, yeah.
That's quite good. There's a file, it's sort of animated, sort of the basic principles of Syntropy laid out in a nice little booklet that I'll attach as well to this email. So machetes, sorghum email, and Syntropy file to that. Aside from that, just different YouTube clips on food forest or syntropic ag, that forest and the ultimate fruit and nut book's really good. And Mark Shepherd is actually quite interesting to listen to his podcast. He doesn't label himself as syntropic agroforestry. He does more what he labels as alley cropping, which is sort of pre syntropy. Sort of,
yeah, he could learn a bit from syntropy.
Yeah, but he's more temperate climate. So for those not so much up in the northern region or more temperate regions, he might be a really great resource. And he's quite articulate as well in his podcast, so it's quite easy to listen to. And he's got a great book out as well. So that could be another handy guy to. And Ali, by Namaste.
By Namaste, yeah, that online course is by Namaste, and it's a nice course, but yeah, sometimes they seem to have mixed the films up with the subtitles, so it's a bit hard going, but it's still, yeah, it's a good course.
And here we've got another question by Kirsten saying, do you use willow for chop and drop? Yes, but willows are more of a sort of riparian wetland area, so what we tend to do with our willows that are planted along there is we actually prune them back quite heavily and then actually take them away from the riparian zone, so we don't mulch them back there, because the whole purpose of a riparian zone is to filtrate the water and catch the nitrogen before it runs off. So by mulching it on the ground, you're slowing the nitrogen cycle to the water, but eventually that nutrients is going to end up back in the water through the decomposition of the leaves. So if your willows are in more of a wetland area, I would suggest using that wetland area then as your catchment of those nutrients, and then whenever you prune anything in that area, to actually take it back on the farm, whether that's as chipping in a stable or whether that's in a food forest further up. So not so much chop and drop in situ.
Yeah, and also in any flood areas, which where you would have your willows and riparian areas especially, is you don't want all of that stuff ending up in a fence somewhere.
Exactly.
And so what we try to do in riparian areas is not chop and drop. We want to do cut and carry. So we cut the branches and we take them to our goats, and especially those willows such as, I should really learn that word. It's I think Kayusanagi, something like that. It's a Japanese for the willow.
Oh, that one, yeah.
And it grows like mad, and it stays green. It's still totally green, and it's still a great fodder, even so we passed shortest day. And they also come up fairly soon again. So it's almost evergreen willow. And they produce ridiculous amounts of biomass and of course good fodder and good tannin content for the goats for parasite control. Righty, we should leave something for the next time.
Cool. Well, that was an awesome session. Sorry for anyone that had technical issues on your end getting on. Like I said, I think next time I will set it up as a live chat with the link sent to you just prior to the video, rather than scheduling a live session. Hopefully that works out. Oh, got one last question from unknown person. I think you introduced yourself further up as a Dutch guy in Portugal. Hello. I think you might be our only non-Kiwi or based in New Zealand. You are asking, what are the first steps to start improving the soil from scratch? We have a very dry climate and lots of clay soil here in Portugal. What are the first steps to start improving the soil from scratch? Whew. Density.
Yeah.
Vegetation, really.
If it's really, really, really bad, then look for the weeds that want to grow there in your area, and maybe open the soil a bit by scratching and digging, so you can actually get seeds in there and use those very weeds, but denser than what they would normally do, and give them a bit of a run for half a year, whilst you start putting your thoughts together what other plants you come up with next. And if it's really bad, that is, and it's what wants to work there already, look for that. That's always a good one. And Portugal and eucalypts they seem to be almost like an adopted native for you guys. It's eucalypt does well, so does pine. So you might as well put some of those guys in, of course, but not with the idea to let them run up until they're malleable timber. I've seen recently some photos from a sort of sandy, poor site in Germany doing syntropy, and they used pines. And I had started to advise some people to do the same here. Why not? Pines want to be in places where a lot of other trees don't want to perform, and they perform fantastic. You prune them up. You can't take the tip off. They don't like that, and that's the downside. But as you do with pines, you clip them up. You don't want to have Christmas trees standing around. And underneath them, I mean, at least here in New Zealand, pines are a fantastic nurse crop. Any native loves growing under pine trees. So depending what you're doing, pine trees can give you, like in windy sites. I mean, even for you, Alan, for instance, it could be a thing that you shouldn't be afraid of either. In the first years, they're cheapest chips because they're produced by the millions, and they're sold here and there, and they cost you nothing, and they establish easy, no sweat. They have heaps of mycorrhiza with them. And then after 5 years of pruning them up into a beanpole with just a little miniature Christmas tree on the top, then you say, okay, it's enough. You get rid of them and use them as beanstalks, whatever. Or cut the tip off and they die, and you use them as a climbing frame for something, whatever. But meanwhile, they have given you shelter. They have opened up the soil for you. They have done heaps of fungal activity in your soil. So just like eucalypts, you use those if you feel they are actually even better suited, or you have a mix of them. So don't be afraid of using those things that you normally would turn your nose up upon. Sure, you don't want something that turns into a persistent weed on your place and might be even illegal. I remember Ernst recommending Ailanthus as a pioneer in Portugal, and people started walking out of the lecture hall. I mean, maybe you don't want to go that extreme, especially if you're a beginner with that. But I'm sure there's something around, and if it's dry and hot, then think prickly pear and so on. So yeah, whatever can handle your situation and thrive, that's what you want. And you plant it dense, and you plant it in rows for easy management. And any weeds that show up, you're not immediately putting a hoe to it. You go down on your knees and do selective weeding, and you prune your weeds. If it's really extreme, you prune your weeds. You treat them like your best friends and make them work for you. And at the same time, make sure that they have what they need. And then out of that emerges your food forest sooner or later. So that's how you start in extreme situations. And if you have extreme situations plus fire risk, then you have to put in some things that can handle fire, or like grasses, but still trim them so they don't become a fire hazard themselves, but they survive fire. And other plants that give you a fire break, like succulents and sisal and so on. And also, I mean, if those plants have thorns, don't be afraid of thorns. Wear gloves, Don't say, oh, I'm not going to do that because it has thorns on it. Well, wear gloves, be careful. Now, after a few years, you get rid of it.
So basically the principles of that, if you are having really poor soil and starting from scratch in a dry climate, just to really observe the vegetation that you have around you in the landscape, replicate that, use that densely, and then let that evolve the soil into the next phase. And then you can start coming in with the actual trees that you want, keeping the things that are sort of pioneering your soil development, keeping them mulched as a biomass source, developing the soil above ground and below ground, and just really working with the vegetation that wants to grow there naturally, that does really well, to get you to a stage where you can plant the trees that are a bit more delicate. In essence.
Yeah.
And always keep the soil covered, especially in your dry climate. Avoid sort of tilling and then leaving the soil bare. Do try and keep that soil covered as much as possible and ideally not so much just with mulch, but actually with living plants. So try and have the whole area densely occupied with living plants. So whatever can take that situation and then manage that vegetation rather than keeping to a bare ground. Keep that soil covered with live plants.
And whenever we mention pines, eucalypts, and so on, you have to shift your thinking, because normally when you see these guys, they're standing in monocultures and they're ugly and they create an unbalanced soil environment. We're not talking about that. We're talking about mixing them up in your system as a nurse crop. Different story. Okay, and then Wasim Rashid. Okay, he might be another one from outside New Zealand. In dry climates, needs nitrogen fixing crops with non-stop mulching around the year. Yes, of course, mulching around the year, we want it in any climate. Now, the thing with nitrogen fixing trees is sometimes that, or quite often, the case is that they actually don't provide a heck of a lot of mulch, right? Because they put a lot of energy into fixing nitrogen. That energy is diverted from producing mulch. Usually, there are exceptions. Flame tree is an exception. It does both. That's one of the reasons we love it so much. How does it do that? It's a hybrid and it just loves it here. But it needs full sun to do that, of course, like all nitrogen fixing trees. And often you find that some trees that are not nitrogen fixing, like eucalyptus, produce more mulch for you than, say, if you put in instead some acacia. You can prune them more frequently, they regrow faster, they can handle pruning better than acacias, and they can be a better choice. Now, okay, they don't fix nitrogen. Well, if it was all about nitrogen fixation, then that's all we would see in a forest, and nitrogen fixer. So the mulch that you produce and the sugar that the plants feed into the soil, they feed also free living bacteria that can also fix nitrogen. Might not be in such bountiful amounts as a true legume, but if there's more sugar going in the soil, then it can sometimes even outweigh that. So don't get fixed on nitrogen fixation. It is helpful. We want some of it in the system, no doubt about that, but it doesn't mean that all those trees we put in have to be nitrogen fixers. Not quite at all like that.
I think maybe also, Wasim, your comment was an answer actually to the question we were just touching on, in a sense advising that in dry climate one needs nitrogen fixing crops with non-stop mulching around the year, which I think is a fair point, because if you are in dry climate and your soil is poor of nitrogen, it is an advantage to have plants that are, taking that nitrogen from somewhere else rather than from the soil. But I think, like Klaus highlighted, actually just doing whatever, the priority is still trees and plants that grow best in that site. So it might not be a nitrogen fixer, but it does a really good job, produces a lot of biomass, which then can, like Klaus was saying, feed the nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil as well. So really a mix of both, not over prioritizing the nitrogen fixation plants, valuing them, but the main priority being plants that do really well in that area.
And then talking about dry land and nitrogen fixing trees, the obvious choice, say for instance Portugal, legume tree, carob tree, right? But then most books tell you it's a nitrogen fixer. However, when you actually look a bit closer, and they don't seem to be fixing nitrogen. They are in a subgroup of legume trees that are actually full of exceptions, and therefore you choose a legume tree and you might find it's actually not the nitrogen fixing that you hope for. So there's that to watch out for too. So yeah, it's complex. It's very complex, but it's learning about life.
Yeah, it mainly just sums up to observing nature, planting what does well, really.
Yeah, and become geeks. Just find the information wherever you can and just learn and learn and learn.
Awesome. So that was a really good session. Thank you all for joining. And yeah, look forward to hosting another session next month. This time I'll put the link straight on the website as before it goes live. And tentative date, but probably will be on July Sunday the 11th. So July Sunday the 11th, and I'll put a little poll out to everyone on this tier, what works best, morning or evening. And again, we'll be holding 2 next month, and we'll just alternate that way. But I will set up a poll, seeing what time best suits you all, so we have the majority of people that can come on. But again, these are always recorded, so if you did miss it or missed some of them, after this I'll upload it onto the interactive tier, and you can go through it whenever you want, however many times you want, at the pace that you want. So yeah, thanks again for
your question, guys, and thank you so much for joining us on that.
Yeah,
awesome.
Thanks a lot. And if you do have a bit of time, we would appreciate if you could do a little testimonial, just how you're finding the live Q&A, so that we can use that to advertise and get more people on there. Gives us the feedback. Yeah, anything you feel like we could do better, and anything you feel like we could write as a testimony would be great, just to let people know what's going on in this secret little community of ours. Cool. Thanks again for a great session, and see you next month.
Happy gardening, forest gardening.